Hi, I'm Charles. Welcome to the Church in Action podcast, where we talk about making disciples, doing justice, and sharing Jesus to accelerate evangelism. Because when the people of God do the work of God, it transforms lives, communities, and the world. Our guest today is Reverend Dana Baker, who leads the Boston Trauma Healing Collaborative, which is part of the Boston Collaborative. Dana, thanks so much for being with us. And thanks for your critical work. I think this is going to be a really important conversation for the church.
I'm so glad to be here today.
Before we dig into trauma and what you're doing in the space, could you maybe give us a little bit of background about your story, how you came to be in New England, a little bit about where you've been in New England ministry and otherwise?
Sure, be happy to. So I'm actually an Oklahoma girl. I was raised in Oklahoma, not from New England at all. Very, very different part of the country. I was born in St. Louis, and my parents were making their way back towards Oklahoma, where they were both raised after having been out of the state for 10 years. And then I was raised in Oklahoma, in Oklahoma City, just on the north side of the state capital. Until I was 18. And then I went to school at Rice University in Houston, Texas for architecture. That actually was my initial vocational desire, was to be an architect. And then what brought me to New England was that during between my fourth and fifth years of architecture school, they had what was called a preceptorship program, which was essentially an apprentice program where it was a small architecture school. There were only 30 students in each class, in the entering freshman class. And I think we actually graduated 8. So it was a pretty tough program. But those of us that did make it through the 4 years, we were able to have internships with really good firms across the United States. And so because my parents actually had lived in Boston during those 10 years, while my dad went to MIT, for his graduate work in architecture. He was an architect as well. They were comfortable if they were going to send their daughter anywhere. They liked the idea of her going to a city that they knew. So I went there for an internship in 1979, 1980, before I went back and finished school. And I just fell in love with New England. From the moment I arrived, I loved it. I loved everything about it. And when I actually had hoped maybe I would go back after I graduated, but there wasn't a position for me then. So I stayed in Houston and worked for a few years, but stayed in touch with the firm that I had worked for in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And then in 1983, when I went for my licensing exam, I reconnected with them and found out that they were hiring, took that leap of faith, moved to New England. In terms of my own faith journey, I was raised Southern Baptist in Oklahoma. I made a profession of faith when I was 13 at a youth camp, was very involved in our church youth choir that actually traveled in Europe, actually. So we did a choir trip one time to Scotland and England and Portugal. So got to do some great things there. So was grounded in the faith from an early age. But Boston would ultimately end up being a very important part of my own faith journey as well. So when I returned to Boston in 1983, I had gone to Tremont Temple Baptist Church during my internship year. But then I started going to Park Street Church. And that was really where I recommitted my faith. I would often say that, Jesus became my savior at age 13, but he became Lord of my life through a discipleship band at Park Street Church, 5 women. We met for a year, very, very powerful year, and just really connected me in a deep way. So then I practiced architecture in Boston for 20 years. First in Cambridge, mostly in Cambridge and in Somerville. And then towards the end of my vocational career in architecture, I had my own firm for a few years when I was trying to juggle motherhood and, and work and all of those kinds of things. But I think even though I was practicing architecture, I was doing what a lot of lay leaders do. I was trying to find a way to practice my faith. And so I did a lot of work in the city of Boston. Again, I fell in love with Boston, started doing ministry in Boston from the very beginning. Did work with Habitat for Humanity, did work with Emmanuel Gospel Center, doing affordable housing and different things around that. So, just really finding this. And then right after my husband and I got married, we were actually in office romance, met at the firm where I had done my internship. And when we got married, we went to a small Baptist church in Medford Square for the first few years of our marriage, and then eventually found our way to Grace Chapel, where some of his relatives had been attending for a number of years. And I became very involved in their urban ministry program called Bridge Builders. And the pastor at the time, Marian Michener, became not only the pastor that I partnered underneath, but she also became my mentor and a very close friend. So that really leads to the story of how I ended up in vocational ministry. She started feeling like God was calling her away from that particular ministry, and she had been challenged to not leave it up to chance who would replace her. And so, unbeknownst to me, she started praying that God would call me into ministry. And without telling me, God did. Pretty long story there, but just amazing how it worked out. And so then a few years later, in 2000, I joined the staff of Grace Chapel in October of 2000. And I served there for 18 and a half years in a wide variety of roles in urban and multicultural ministry. And then my final title before I left in the spring of 2019 was the pastor of social justice and multicultural ministry. And then from there, it leads into my trauma work. So that's probably a good overview.
And so you wanted to build buildings. God had a plan for you to build a kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's true. It's
Not
true.
that you can't do both together, but
Yeah.
there's something in there.
But it has been interesting because, I mean, I've often talked to me because my heart has always been for urban ministry. And so having had that architecture degree, having had a father who loved urban planning, sort of a lot of those pieces, God has used them in pretty remarkable ways in how I look and view and do ministry. So
It's almost like God has a plan.
I think so. Absolutely.
Well, it would have to do something to take you from the state of Garth Brooks and Reba McEntire to get you up to Boston.
Absolutely. And it was definitely culture shock. But I have to say, I've told people that I actually do some, because I've now obviously been here far longer than I ever was in Oklahoma. And I often will say I'm a New Englander who just happened to be born in Missouri and raised in Oklahoma because I love it here. I really do. And I feel like it fits me very well.
And so tell me a little bit about what is the Boston Healing Collaborative? What do you guys
So the
do?
Boston Trauma Healing Collaborative actually is only a year old. And so my work in trauma healing actually began before, quite a while before the Boston Trauma Healing Collaborative came into existence. And actually, my work in trauma healing began while I was still on the staff at Grace Chapel, because in my role as pastor of social justice and multicultural ministry, I had partnered with our senior pastor, Brian Wilkerson, to, in 2010, launch something called Greater Things for Greater Boston, which was a church partnership network. And I think it's quite possibly something that you've talked about on these podcasts before, but it was a church partnership network that was attempting to try and bring together urban and suburban churches in order to address unacceptable realities, build relationships, prayer, just a whole host of things. And one of the things that we did with Greater Things for Greater Boston is that we tried to discover and find innovative models of ministry in the city, and then raise them up to the pastors, both in the city and the suburbs, and create awareness around the work that they were doing with the hopes that people could become more engaged. And so one of those areas of ministry ministries that we discovered was called the Corey Johnson Program for Post-Traumatic Healing, that had been birthed out of Roxbury Presbyterian Church after, about 4 years after Roxbury Presbyterian Church had lost one of its church members to gun violence. Corey Johnson, who the program is named after, had been killed in 2010, while Herman Hamilton was the pastor there. And the whole Fitzgerald and Johnson family, they just were pillars of the church, and it just devastated the church community. And so while they did some work to help that particular family heal at the time, it just had long-term ramifications. And so then when Reverend Liz Walker became the pastor of the church, very soon after her arrival at the church, she obviously was very aware of the gun violence and the violence going on in the community around her. And so she just, and I think there was actually a shooting really on the sidewalk out in front of the church, soon after she arrived. And so she just knew that she had a choice, either to just pull in and kind of bar the doors from the violence or be part of the solution. And so out of that was birthed the Corey Johnson program for post-traumatic healing with, named after Corey. So anyway, I discovered that through in 2016. And so we held what we just used to call them conversations on the work of God in New England. And so we gathered a group of pastors to come together. And so in getting to know Reverend Liz and Colleen Sharka, and hosting this pastors gathering to explain what the model of ministry was, I got to know them. And it was a powerful time. I mean, I could not believe how many of the pastors shared. And it was the first time I shared some of my trauma in a public space. After that conversation was over, I continued attending the program, even while I remained on the staff at Grace Chapel, and just found remarkable healing in my own journey. Even though I had gone through counseling, had, dealt with this, through kind of some of the therapeutic models, this particular model long-term abiding was exactly what I needed to continue to walk out my healing. So it became a very personal journey for a few years in my final years on the staff at Grace Chapel. And then I really just felt this sense that I had completed the work at Grace Chapel that God had called me to, that God had something more. And what I just kept hearing, even though I didn't know exactly what that was, I just kept hearing, I want you to invest more intentionally in the city. And so I looked at a number of different options, and then just felt like I needed to take a step of faith. And so I left in March of 2019, not knowing exactly kind of what I was going to do, but certainly having the Corey Johnson program in the back of my mind. So that was how I transitioned into trauma healing.
And so now, as coming out of that, the Corey Johnson program, Roxbury Pres, has been this program, Can We Talk?
Correct.
Trying to deal
Correct.
with trauma. And so before, I want to talk about that. Before we do, I remember we had Dr. Karen Mason from Gordon Conwell,
Okay.
you probably know, and we talked about what is trauma. And her definition, and I won't get it exactly right, it was some big deal event that happens to you.
Correct.
That then has long-term implications. And the fact that you went through the same exact thing I went through, you may suffer trauma, I may not, because of different other things in my life, or we both may, or neither one of us may. But the idea is it's not as simple as if you go through A, B, and C, you will have experienced trauma.
Correct.
And so, but we see things playing out today, having gone through, there was trauma well before COVID. We're seeing people play things out in ways that seem completely irrational. And it seems to be that at least some of that is tying back to what I'm going to call a post-COVID trauma. And when I say COVID, I mean everything that's happened the last 2 years, election, George Floyd, everything. Am I thinking about it right, Dana? And if so, does that mean we're going to see a big uptick in people dealing with trauma?
Well, so I want to back up just a little bit, because actually I think you did a really good summary. You were listening well to Dr. Mason, because a lot of people don't understand that. I mean, what you said that was so important to understand is that yes, it is. So the classic definition of trauma goes back to when PTSD became part, mental health diagnosis back in the 1980s. And they were actually very clear that at that particular point that trauma had to be something external. Now we understand trauma as being far more than that, and you got a sense of that. But so yes, it is something that happens from the outside, but it has impact. But that was sort of the early stages when they were really trying to wrestle with how does trauma work, and even just giving it some clinical support so that people could honestly treat trauma from war and trauma from genocide and some of those big T trauma things. But that was in the 1980s. So we're now talking almost 40 years later. They've come to understand that, as you said, trauma is much more broad-based, and that there is interpersonal trauma, that there is all kinds of trauma that are going on. And as you said, what is traumatic for some people is not traumatic for another. And so I would say, even pre-COVID, that because this is so new, one of my traumatic experiences was nearly losing my son when he was 3 years old. He developed hemolytic uremic syndrome from eating an undercooked hamburger and nearly died at the age of 3. He was in Children's Hospital for 6 weeks. He was clinically dead at one point during that time. It took almost 2 years for his kidneys to return to some semblance of order, but he now has long-term kidney damage. So, we now know that and I was actually 7 months pregnant with my daughter at the time.
Oh, wow.
We now know that our entire family was traumatized by that experience.
Yeah.
We were at Children's Hospital, one of the premier hospitals in the entire country, and not once did anyone ever mention trauma to us. Not once were we encouraged to go get help for the trauma that our family experienced. Not once was my son. Now, they did do some things to try and minimize what he would remember and other things like that so that they could minimize the traumatic impact, but there was no follow-up. And again, I don't blame them because there really wasn't that much knowledge. It was a developing, area. Now there has been such an explosion in the area of neuroscience, in the understanding of the brain, and even in terms of understanding the impact of what's happening in your brain on the rest of your body physically. So even in the medical community, the trauma understanding has been exploded. Within the church, I think there has been, up until very, very recently, almost no understanding. When I was going through another traumatic episode in my mid-40s, I was on the staff at Grace Chapel, and honestly, I don't think that there was any of us on the staff, I mean, myself, obviously, but even any of the other pastors that really knew how to come alongside me in dealing with this manifestation of panic attacks and different things like that had happened through this traumatic episode. And so, here a highly trained and equipped pastoral staff, really wasn't equipped to help someone dealing with deep trauma. So my heart has been, as I've, gone into this further, even in my own personal story, is to say, how can we equip people in the church? And so really the whole idea behind the Boston Trauma Healing Collaborative was to do 3 things. One was to provide programs by drawing from expertise from both local programs like Can We Talk, and then national programs like the American Bible Society, trauma healing groups, and other things that are happening in Boston, because there's some other work that's been being done, Tina Cherry and the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute. So there's been a lot of work around trauma. So how can we draw from this to help individuals on their own trauma healing journey? But I also, in the work that I did on the staff at Grace Chapel, also worked with volunteers that were working among traumatized populations. And they were often very confused by the reactions that they got. They would have this great passion to want to go in and support and help people. And then they didn't understand. They would say, well, they don't feel very grateful, or they're acting really angry, or they're acting in ways we don't understand. And so the other goal that I have is really to equip volunteers and churches to be able to work with people that have experienced trauma and be able to respond in an appropriate way to how those trauma symptoms are being manifested.
Because it's rarely a case, in my understanding, where I go through an experience and I raise my hand, right? Going back to your example, say, oh, I'm experienced some trauma. May I have help with that, please?
Correct.
It's I just continue on with my life, and that may manifest itself in any number of ways. That now people just may not want to be around me because, right? But then
they get confused and they actually misinterpret. I mean, sadly, like with children that are exhibiting trauma symptoms, they're actually labeled as children that have behavioral issues, as opposed to. And so one of the things that was very important in the work that we do is reframing the question and not saying what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. What is it that happened to you, and how did you cope with that? And is that coping mechanism still working? So going back to your COVID question. So I think there was a whole lot of education that was needed around trauma, even before COVID, but people were able to compartmentalize and say, oh, that person has trauma, I don't have trauma. And I think what's happened with COVID, because it has been so pervasive, because it has impacted everybody at a deep level, people are much more open to the possibility of considering Oh, wow. A pandemic is a traumatic event and it's something that we all share. So it actually opens up a possibility of dialogue and understanding for people to think about my experience, your experience, traumatic experience, how is my behavior, your behavior, and then exactly what you were just saying, that if we've all experienced this traumatic event and we're all exhibiting traumatic behavior or behavior coming out of a trauma, that some of that actually is coming from our trauma, not because we're just trying to be difficult or divisive with one another.
Yeah, the example I always think of is back when I was still in the corporate world, we started a technology center down in New Orleans. And at the time, New Orleans was the murder capital of the world. And
Mm,
they had a piece in the New York Times about it where they were interviewing the chief of police and they were saying, why can't you fix this like every other city has? And regardless of what you think about how every other city did it, he said, look, it's basically simple. In those cities, you identify, you look at the data, where's the crime, you send patrols there, you stop people, you talk to them, you identify who's at risk, you arrest those people, and you drive down crime. Said, what happens in New Orleans is I wake up and you're parked in front of my house this morning and I shoot you.
mm,
I don't know how to deal with that. And the issue was, it was all this hangover from Katrina because my grandparents drowned. I lost
correct.
my home. We
Yeah.
went to Houston. I didn't get a job. Now I'm still trying to catch up, and we're into right. And now it only takes one more thing when I'm up to here to set me off the edge. And it seems to me that that's what we're seeing sometimes in churches today,
Mhm.
with people just blowing up at pastors, leaving churches over the silliest things. Now, some of that may point to some other issues, but it certainly sounds like some of the people experiencing trauma and them maybe not knowing it, and the pastor and other people in church not being able to identify, let alone know what to do about it. Am I thinking about it the right way?
Yeah, so there's a very important distinction. So stress in and of itself is not bad. You probably know that. In fact, stress can actually, take us to a point of giving, the adrenaline and all of that can sort of help us to do things. But post traumatic stress is what becomes problematic because what's happened is, so what happens when the stress becomes traumatic is you either go into a state of what's called hyper arousal or hyper, I forgot what the opposite is, but basically,
Well,
depression, like a depressive state.
okay.
So you're either hyper vigilant, anxiety, all of those kinds of things, or you are depressed, shut down, freeze, all of these kinds of things. Your goal is to try and be in the middle, where you can where you can manage where you can express the emotions, but you can manage them. But when you're in that hyper arousal state, or if you're in that hyper depressive state, you can't function the way you should. And so, not being able to get out of being hyper aroused, that actually starts to affect your body. It starts to affect your emotions. It starts to affect your behavior. And so people think, well, why can't you just calm down? But when you're out, when you're above the line, is what we call it, you sometimes can't, if you don't know techniques or you don't know how to get yourself, resettled. That's why we often use the term de-escalating people, trying to figure out how to de-escalate a situation. And it's not yelling at somebody and telling them to do
Right.
something differently. It's actually doing exactly the opposite of trying to create a place where you help people to calm down. So there's specific strategies that you can use to help, mindfulness strategies that you can use to help sort of calm people, bring things back to the center. But again, this is not language that we know. It's not language that we share. It's again, we still, I think, there's stigma around trauma. We tend to think that trauma is for very broken people, as opposed to who the rest of us are, rather than seeing that this is something that a lot, all of us probably at some level experience at some point in our life.
Well, and sometimes the church can get this pretty wrong, as in other areas of mental health, right? This is not
Correct.
to point with too broad a brush, but sometimes we can be on the, hey, look, you just need to pray more, right? Maybe there's some
Correct.
sin in your life, and those are not bad things to examine, but that's not the solution to every problem either.
Correct.
And so how does Can We Talk try and work in this space and minister to people?
Yeah, so what they realized with Can We Talk is that it was not that the therapeutic model didn't work. We knew that, but they recognized that the therapeutic model didn't work in all situations. Sometimes it was because it wasn't available. I mean, there was actually, we worked with a student at Northeastern who did a study in a few of the neighborhoods around Roxbury Presbyterian Church, and she found out that of the people that needed mental health supports, only 30% were able to get them within the first 90 days of needing them. Another 30% got them within 90 to 120 days, and 30% of the people in the surrounding community never were able to get mental health supports at all. So that just the need far outstrips the availability. But then there's all kinds of other things of stigma. There's lack of, especially within communities of color, there's lack of trust in the health, systems at all. Trauma actually shuts down some of your prefrontal cortex or your executive function of your brain, which actually makes it hard to engage with some mental health supports that are there. So what they recognized was that they needed a model that actually would come alongside people, but would come alongside with their community peers. So it's a peer model that helps to come alongside people by creating a safe space where people can share stories. And there also is science behind the idea that sharing stories, that sharing narratives, because one of the things that happens during trauma is you lose a sense of connection and you lose a sense of meaning and purpose. And oftentimes the way traumatic events happen, your mind only engages with it in fractured ways. And so part of the process of healing is being able to start to put some of those stories and fragments back together. So the process of sharing your story is part of that reconnection with one another. Well, so it's part of the reestablishing of meaning and purpose and understanding your story and putting those fragments back together. But it also addresses the lack of connection and isolation that people that have had trauma experience, because it's done in community. The therapeutic model is a one-on-one thing where the therapist is trying to help you work through your story. At Can We Talk, which is done in a group where people come together to share stories, you are actually making connections and relationships with people. You're coming out of isolation and being with one another in the sharing of stories. And what's so amazing about Can We Talk is that people share for 3 to 5 minutes. It's very short. And that's actually a good thing because it allows them to share parts of the story, but they don't get so deep into the story that it actually, starts to re-trigger them. They may be emotional, but the awesome thing is that even if you're not sharing your story yourself, we say that people that are there, as long as they are that listening is as important as people sharing. And oftentimes people may not share for months when they come. But by listening to other people's stories, they realize, wow, I'm not alone. What I'm experiencing is not unusual. Other people are experiencing similar things. They will gain language. I mean, the number of times I've heard people stand up and go, wow, I didn't know I had trauma. Now I know I have trauma. Now I have language for what it is I'm experiencing. Somehow just having language for what I'm experiencing can help settle me and help me understand that, I'm not alone.
Completely
So
agree.
it's really just an opportunity to come and share. So we just share for an hour. The other piece, though, that's important with Can We Talk is we provide artists, because the other piece that's very important to know is that this is not just something that's happening in your brain. It's actually happening to your whole body. And they've learned over time. The Body Keeps the Score was one of the seminal works that was published in 2014. And the trauma can actually get into the connective tissues of your muscles and get into your body and cause long-term physical health. So movement, music, art and writing, all kinds of ways are needed to get at and actually release this post-traumatic, the stress that's been stored in your body. So we have artists, dancers, musicians, saxophone players, and try and really get at how do we help people heal on many different levels.
Well, and it was a distinctive for me too, because I remember you sharing that there's also a clinician there for those rare cases where somebody actually
Right.
does need professional help beyond just sharing. But I'm a Baptist, and there's a food component to it, which is wise
Correct.
as well.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, since COVID started, we haven't been meeting in person as much, so I don't focus on the food component. But yeah, when we're meeting in person, which we're starting to get back to with some of our groups, it starts out with a dinner. And so oftentimes, that can be the first point of connection and community and fellowship. And so the whole idea is this, that the violence happened, especially in the churches, the communities like those that surround Roxbury Presbyterian Church, that the violence happened in the community. So community and violence, needs a community response.
And so Can We Talk is an ongoing program, right,
Right.
where it exists, where folks are coming together and building some level of fellowship, but gives a place to share my story, hear other stories, put words to it, and kind of work through the trauma. And I might come, I think I heard you say for years,
Hmm.
or I might come for a short period of time.
Might come once, right,
Once.
right.
And
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 then
so,
we do also do, in addition to the Can We Talk, which is the core part of our program, we do offer trauma education where we help, go through different aspects of trauma. And, a couple of those were just, eye-opening for me and pivotal moments in my own journey. We do an art and writing night. We do some body movement nights. So, there are other components that have grown out of it from this core Can We Talk, but that's the core model, that peer-to-peer um, safe space and sharing of stories is really the core model for Corey Johnson.
and you to speak to it, if you would, for a second, about you're looking to expand the Can We Talk program, because it's, can you share where it is today and what you're
Correct.
thinking about?
Yeah. So the RPC started in 2014, and we now have fo- four other Can We Talks in the Greater Boston area. We have one at Fourth Presbyterian Church. We have one at it's called RDPIC, Roxbury Dorchester Power and Community, which is a partnership of Episcopal churches. We have one at Bethel AME in Lowell. And we have one at Codman Square, which is a partnership of several churches in the Codman Square area, along with the Emmanuel Gospel Center and some other organizations. Second Church in Dorchester and others there. And then we now also have one. We have two in Providence, Rhode Island, and then we have a replication site in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
And I think, to me, one of the interesting things is that, we there's a gap in the church. We don't know how to deal with this in our congregations. But what I love about Can We Talk is it's not just about serving my congregation, it's about serving my
Oh, it's
community.
about serving the community. No,
Right? And when
absolutely.
we serve our communities, suddenly people care what we have to say about Jesus.
Right.
There's an
Right.
evangelistic, even though the program is not designed to be an evangelistic tool, it's evangelistic at the end of the day,
Right.
right?
Well, what people do is they come in, they're held in the church, and over time people have decided, okay, well, if this church cares enough about me, maybe I should go check. So we hold it in the church basement, but people eventually make their way upstairs on
Right?
Sunday mornings. It's
It's
not a huge number of people, but I think it's also the opposite way, in that people that attend the church will realize that they need and can benefit from this, and will often come and take advantage of what's happening in the basement as well. So it works both ways.
And now you guys have another program that you're also working on. So
Correct.
different flavor, if you will, but also dealing with trauma. There's a partnership with the American Bible Society. Can you talk a little bit
Correct.
about that?
Correct. Yeah. So my initial work when I left Grace Chapel was to work with the Corey Johnson program, because that's what I knew. But then around that same time, the American Bible Society had been going into different cities, because they had a trauma healing program that had actually come out of East Africa in the 1990s, again in response to genocide. Where they found that people that missionaries and different groups that were working in these areas of East Africa, they just were finding that they were seeing trauma everywhere, that they were finding that it was very hard to engage these people without dealing with the trauma first. And so they brought in mental health experts and designed a curriculum that could meet and help people with very little education. And so the core idea behind it was that it had to be easily translatable, easily replicatable, and it had to be able to be replicatable by people that were not trained in trauma. And so they developed this wonderful core curriculum of 6 lessons that lay leaders within the churches in Africa could replicate it in areas to work with people and help them heal from trauma. And it's called Healing the Wounds of the Heart. And so that's going back to that initial definition. So the actual Greek word for trauma is wound, so sometimes that's actually a more accessible word to talk about, this idea of wound, or a wound of the heart, rather than trauma, because it doesn't feel quite so scary. It also feels like something that's more shareable between people. So anyway, that curriculum replicated all over the world. I mean, I think it's in, gosh, probably over 100 countries now, like almost 150,000 sort of people or facilitators and different things through that. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago that they started realizing, okay, this program that's been working so effectively in other parts of the world, maybe it would work effectively here in the United States. And so they started checking, they started in a few. I think the first one was in Kansas City. They worked with an organization that was doing it in prisons and jails, but then they started recognizing that there was value here. And so they started going and connecting with leaders in different cities. And Boston was one of the places that they reached out to. And so we made some connections early on. And so that was really what officially launched Boston Trauma Healing Collaborative, because we are now an official partner of the American Bible Society in terms of implementing and training facilitators to run these trauma healing groups here in the greater Boston and New England area. So that started, in November of last year. The difference between the two, and this is what I love about, and the idea with Boston Trauma Healing Collaborative, again, was to try and draw from multiple models, because Corey Johnson program, as you kind of alluded to, is a long-term abiding, there literally have been people that have been coming for the full 7 years of the program and gain and learn over time. But it is a complex thing to replicate in terms of the amount of training that's necessary, finding the right community, being able to transfer the DNA of this Can We Talk model so that it has the same organic safety that we were able to establish in the first one. Whereas the American Bible Society is 6 weeks. It's a small group curriculum. It can be integrated within a church's small group curriculum in some very, innovative ways, but it's much more easily replicatable. And so when we started in last year in November, there were 5 of us that had been trained as apprentice facilitators the previous summer when we were still learning more about this. And as of this past October, we've now trained 10 additional apprentice facilitators, and we've made connections with other facilitators so that we actually have connections of 24 different facilitators in the New England area now. Each group is co-facilitated, but I just am so excited because with this number of facilitators, we actually are, poised going into 2022 to be able to really start having an impact, throughout New England. So.
And this one, I heard you contrast is that this is more a 6-week program in a church. Somebody comes in and works with you in your church to go through the program, and then they go and you've got the skills and all left behind. Is that about right?
Hold on one second. I think I'm going to put in my earbuds here. I'm hearing a leaf blower out in my backyard, and I want to make sure people on the podcast can't hear that.
We're not hearing it.
You're not hearing it. Okay, then I won't worry about it. Just let me know if you do.
Thanks.
So sorry, ask the question again, Charles.
So I was just saying, so the idea is that this one is somebody comes into your church and works with you for 6 weeks to do this program, and it's kind of 1 night a week program for the folks who come to it, and then they leave, but they've left behind the skills and stuff.
No. What our goal is to actually identify people within churches that have a heart for trauma healing. And then we invite them into what's called an initial equipping, where they go through a trauma healing group themselves, because it's a very experiential program. We also believe that oftentimes there are things within our own journey that we haven't identified for ourselves. And so the idea is that everyone that leads one of these groups needs to have gone through this experience themselves and potentially identify areas where they need to get healing in their own lives first. And then they are equipped to trained to facilitate and lead a group. And then they have to do 2 practicums before they are certified to be able to go on leading healing groups. But the idea is to actually train up facilitators within particular churches, and rather than sort of come. So that, I think what you described, Charles, is kind of what I'm doing, and that I might go in and help lead it. But the idea is to stay within that setting long enough to be able to leave behind co-facilitators that are there.
Who might do that program over and over again in their church.
Yes.
Okay. I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. But again, what I've really become excited about is, so Park Street Church was one of the first churches that we did this with. And so I helped hold healing groups there last spring, but we now have 3 apprentice facilitators there. And we're very interested in looking into, is this something where the facilitators could actually work through the small group system that's there? Because what's nice about that is, even though it's a 6-week curriculum, it takes a little bit of trust to get ready. And then it's sort of like, but what happens sort of after it's over? And so the small group system gives you a really great opportunity to be able to both continue the ongoing dialogues after it's over with people that are equipped and have shared language, and be able to talk about it. So,
Well, Dana, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for this ministry and highlighting the need. There is a huge need in the church for this coming out of COVID that's becoming so clear and more clear each day. And having the churches you work with will be on the forefront of helping others figure out how to meet this need in their churches and their communities. So thank you so much for doing it. Thank you for making time for us to talk about it. To our audience, I would say thank you for being with us. If you have heard something in this that you need, that you're like, God is calling me to this work, or we need Dana's help, Dana, how do they get to you?
So my email address is pretty easy. It's dana@bostoncollaborative.org. So email at Dana at bostoncollaborative.org.
DANA.
At DANA at bostoncollaborative.org, and reach out to me. And we're going to be holding some information sessions for leaders. We're going to be holding some initial equippings. And so there's going to be some real opportunities in the new year. I will also will be feeding information to you, Charles, to put on the Vision New England website. We actually did that, or the Facebook page, and we actually did that and had one of the pastors in Connecticut go through the initial equipping in October. So people can just keep an eye out for the Facebook page and other, information coming out from Vision New England.
Great. Yeah, we'll continue to share it through all our channels because we think this is so critical. Thanks again. Thank you to our producer, Jessica Mangano. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Luis Palau Association, who's dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide. Please like this, share it, follow us. It's on Facebook, YouTube, Apple, Amazon, Google, Spotify. And if you want more information, you go to visionnewengland.org. And we're excited to share that starting in January, our podcast is going to be available on life-changing radio stations across New England at 2 p.m. on Sundays. To find your local station, you go to lifechangingradio.com. And our first guest of the new year will be Gordon McDonald talking about making disciples. So we're excited about that. Stay tuned next week. We'll have Reverend Enoch Lau, who's the pastor of Boston Chinese Evangelical Church and a frequent podcast guest, interviewing Reverend Stephen Chin, the retired pastor of Boston Chinese Evangelical. And he'll be talking about a lifetime of ministry, the uniqueness of ministering in Boston, being a multi-language, multicultural congregation, and some of the other learnings that he's had through a lifetime of ministry. So thanks for being with us. Watch for that. God bless you. Thanks.